putting this lecture series and the walking tours and the bus tours together for us. I want to also thank the Museum of the Rockies for this space. I'm very honored to be here tonight. I remember the night I stood here and listened to so many amazing people, or I sat here and listened to people like Wallace Stegner and Ivan Doig. So lucky to be here tonight. And I also want to thank the Department of History and Philosophy here at MSU, where I've had the luxury to study. And I feel very blessed to be there, and especially to study under Dr. Mary Murphy, the ever lovely Dr. Mary Murphy, who can't be with us tonight. But she is my doctoral chair, and I'm eternally grateful for her support. So I would like to begin tonight in a good way with this acknowledgement. We acknowledge and honor with respect the Indigenous custodians on whose territories the university now stands, and whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. We ask the spiritual ancestors to forgive our intrusion, and we humbly ask for their guidance. Ani mindina me maganadok, bishkene nishtadam mikwe, indaga, makwa andodam, Mikaju Anundinda, Valley of the Flowers in Ninjaba, Anishinaabe Kwe, Medewan Kwe, and Dao. So I greet you in Ojibwa as I breathe life into our native language, that language which holds our worldview and the foundation of our culture and knowledge of the natural world. And I said, my relatives, I recognize the light in you. The name the spirits know me by is Flaming Horsewoman. I am a member of the Bear Clan. My ancestral home is amongst the Turtle Mountain Band of Ojibwa, but I live here in the Valley of the Flowers. I am Anishinaabe, one of the people, and a Medewan woman, meaning I follow our spiritual path, the path of the heart in the Mede Lodge. I am a descendant of mixed heritage. My grandmothers were Ojibwa, Dakota, Cree, and Inuit, and my grandfathers were French, Dutch, English, and Scottish. And as a result, the people in my family have varying identities, ones that reflect the complexity of the history of our continent. I grew up in a beautiful place, the Rocky Mountain front of Montana, in the community of Shodo. And there along the eastern front runs a series of trails known as the Old North Trail. What remains of the trails is a testament to the story of why my native ancestors were drawn to that place. And as a doctoral student, I am in the process of writing the book that tells that story. It is currently under the working title, Mini Guijiwin, that which is given to us, changing Anishinaabe food systems from 1780 to 1920. There are two things that I want to acknowledge as I begin my talk, and that I feel are quite important as we come to this story. The first is that colonization has been and continues to be the driver of Native American and North American history, and colonization is ongoing. As evidence for the ongoing forces of colonization, I offer the examples of the Dakota Access Pipeline, the recent lawsuit by the Fort Belknap, Ani, and Nakota tribes to protect their water supply from the XL pipeline, and the way in which tribal communities are constantly on guard to defend their land, water, and livelihoods in a court of law. Secondly, I want to acknowledge that Indigenous cultural resilience has been active all along, since the time of contact, and the growing wave of resurgence since the 1960s is steady and growing stronger. So why is this important to acknowledge these two matters? Because there is a latent social energy that surrounds the disturbing facts of the past, which affects our identities, who we know ourselves to be. And that energy drives relationships in the present. How we see history matters to the present. Some folks are particularly sorrowful when they encounter these stories of dispossession and survivance. Others tune out with a sense of overwhelm. Some seek to place blame or find simple explanations to dismiss the complexity of the past and the present. In any case, our emotions become involved. So I want to also acknowledge that colonization, in the historical sense, is not the fault of anyone in this room. However, understanding colonization is the burden of all on this continent. It is the legacy of our shared history. I see the work that I do as an effort to heal some of the wounds of history by building understanding and diffusing some of the burden of colonization. The place where I grew up along the Rocky Mountain front, you may have experienced if you ever drove north from Helena, turned off on Highway 287 just past Wolf Creek, and followed what the Pekani call the backbone of the world, toward their reservation and Glacier National Park. In 1806, on their return trip from the Pacific coast, Lewis and Clark were following the Buffalo Trail Road, in Salish called Kok Alex Iskit, a well-worn path over the mountains, which had been used for centuries by the Columbia Plateau Indians to access buffalo hunting grounds east of the Continental Divide. It was marked by trailblazes, rock cairns, and campsites for those who used it for trade, travel, visiting, and harvesting. On June 30th, 1806, the party reached Traveler's Rest in the Bitterroot Valley near present-day Lolo, Montana. After 3 days' rest, the Corps split into two parties. William Clark's group left to explore the Yellowstone River. Captain Meriwether Lewis and his men set out to explore the northernmost reaches of the Marias River, quote, hoping to exert territorial claim to the Louisiana Purchase, unquote. On July 8th, Lewis and his party, having traversed the mountains along the North Fork of the Blackfoot River, turned north along the eastern front, following the Old North Trail, which Lewis refers to as the road, and Highway 287 now follows. Once they crossed the Dearborn River, Shishakwa Mountain, Haystack Butte, came into view. From Lewis's journals, quote, half a mile further, we observed from a height Shishakwa Mountain, a high, insulated mountain of a conic form, standing several miles in advance of the eastern range of the Rocky Mountains. Here about 8 miles from us and immediately on our road, which was in a northwest direction. But as our object was to strike Medicine River, or Sun River, and hunt down to its mouth to procure skins for food and gear necessary for the men who are to be left at the falls, none of whom are hunters, we determined to leave the road. We therefore proceeded due north through an open plain till we reached Shishakwa Creek, a stream about 20 yards wide, with a considerable quantity of timber in its low grounds. Here we halted and dined, and now felt by the luxury of our food that we were approaching once more the plains of the Missouri, so rich in game. We saw a great number of deer, antelope, goats, wolves, and some barking squirrels, and for the first time caught distant prospect of 2 buffaloes, end quote. Lewis and his men were on their return journey from the west coast, and upon reaching the eastern side of the mountains found a welcome abundance. They are back in the land of plenty. This strikes me, a person raised on the semi-arid slopes of the Rocky Mountain front, as surprising, because today we associate the western side of the Rockies as the verdant one, good for crops and orchards. But as Lewis came over the mountains, he was clearly thinking about his stomach. This gives us a clue about food systems and change over time. Fur trader David Thompson in 1810 returned from his trek over to the western side of the Rocky Mountains, where he had nearly starved to death, emerged onto the plains and proclaimed, As we are now in the land of bison, we hope no more to be in want of provisions. Similarly, Daniel Harmon, when exploring Western Canada early in the 19th century, stated, quote, "In fact, those Indians who reside in the large plains or prairies are the most independent, appear to be the most contented and happy people upon the face of the earth. They subsist on the flesh of buffalo." The happiest people on the face of the earth? This isn't the message we have generally received about hunter-gatherer existence. Just enter your imagination as it's been formed by your education. What images of living on the Northwestern Plains without aid of civilization come up for you? Historians and archaeologists have often painted a picture of a rugged existence, or worse, the images of savages living a hand-to-mouth existence. Authors Maria Nievo Cedeno, Jesse Ballinger, and John Murray observed the flatness of the portrayal of the big game hunters, mainly focused on, quote, behavior and technology, to the exclusion of the rich pursuits of life that are economic, reproductive, political, and future-oriented. Their words are an invitation to revisit the bison culture food system and to wonder when approaching the archive, have we been unduly influenced by the narratives of newcomers, journals of explorers, surveyors, traders, who were fish out of water in their experience of the Northwestern Plains, and followed the buffalo passers through that were not integrated in the food system or the lifeway. My native ancestors lived on the Northwestern Plains and followed the buffalo to the Rocky Mountains. So they would have been some of the most contented and happy people on the face of the earth. They had many names and affiliations, which at times can make the historical record hard to understand. They were aligned with and kin to the Cree and the Assiniboine, and also to the Métis, mixed heritage, Euro-Native American people, who for some time controlled a vast expanse of the continent through their involvement in the fur trade. The Métis eventually became their own nation. Situated in this human web of relationship, the Plains Ojibwa were the Pembina people of the Red River of the North, which is now the border between the states of Minnesota and North Dakota, runs north right through our current ceremonial grounds to Lake Winnipeg and then onward to Hudson's Bay. The Red River Ojibwa began to move west in the late 18th century, following the buffalo farther and farther out onto the plains until they were snugged up against the Rocky Mountains, and no longer made a seasonal round back to the Red River country where they would have harvested wild rice, fish, and maple sugar. Their story is the story I am telling in my doctoral dissertation. I begin that dissertation with the deep history of the place where they land, the Old North Trail corridor, because it is essential to understanding the pull of the buffalo. And that is the part of the story I am here to share with you tonight. The story of this place shows us that, one, reciprocity in the web of relations created a place conducive to bison culture. Two, it gives us a view of what made bison culture the longest standing lifeway in North America. And three, a look at buffalo culture as a highly complex lifeway with social, ceremonial, and economic sophistication that has often been overlooked. So now I want to take you deeper into that place, the corridor or the biome that surrounds the Old North Trail, the ancient north-south trail system that runs along the eastern front of the Rocky Mountains of the Northwestern Plains. Thomas Mooney, who came to Montana in 1868 by steamboat to Fort Benton and settled at Fort Shaw, reported at the time that there was no stock in the Sun River country. But he recalled riding through a bison herd from Fort Keogh, Miles City, all the way to Milk River. He was in the herd for 4 solid days. 4 solid days. But he had arrived at the height of what he described as the human race engaged in wholesale slaughter. He said, quote, "When lying down at night, there was a rumble of earth never to be heard again unless the country again became peopled by large animals." Mooney recollected that after the Custer battle, General Miles established a camp at the mouth of the Tongue River. "Destroy the buffalo and you will solve the Indian question," was the word he sent back to the War Department. Mooney, an Irish immigrant, fur trader, and bison hunter, expressed the deepest remorse for his actions. He stated, "If I ever die of starvation, it would be a judgment against me for the meat I destroyed." By 1889, the information in this map was the story reported by William Hornaday, Smithsonian natural scientist, and, some call him, an early wildlife conservationist. From Montana, where he collected bison specimens in 1886, Hornaday wrote to the Secretary of the Smithsonian, quote, "The total number of buffaloes killed on the expedition, including last spring's work, was 25. I consider that we have been extremely lucky in finding a sufficient number of buffalo where it was supposed by people, generally, that none existed. Our outfit has been pronounced by old buffalo hunters the luckiest outfit that ever hunted buffalo in Montana. And the opinion is quite generally held that our haul of specimens could not be equaled again in Montana by anybody, no matter their resources, for the reason that the buffalo are not there. We killed nearly all we saw, and I am confident there are not over 30 head remaining in Montana, all told. By this time next year, the cowboys will have destroyed about all of this remnant. We got in our exploration just in the nick of time, the last day in the evening, so to speak. And I do not hesitate to say I am really rejoiced over the fact that we have been successful in securing the specimens we so desperately needed. In just about 20 years, the buffalo were swallowed up by the colonial machine. The history is dramatic and shocking. While there are clear connections to be made between the desired outcome of clearing the land of the people who were already here by eliminating their food source and moving them onto reservations, it is also true that the buffalo themselves were colonized, extracted from the land to make way for cattle, railroads, and farming. Their hides were used for conveyor belts in factories as industrialization advanced across the Atlantic from England to the eastern US. For many homesteaders, their first harvest was bison bones as they cleared their land for tilling. Buffalo bones were a cash crop for homesteaders and a resource for manufacturing, crushed up for fertilizer and china dishes, shipped back out to be sold to the growing consumer nation. As for the natural people, the ones who were forcibly removed from the land and stripped of their source of life, the buffalo, they received America's first processed foods. Annuities in the form of white flour, white rice, sugar, lard, and canned meats. In this part of the country, they were delivered by steamboat up the Missouri and distributed by the military presence here. But early distribution was a colossal disaster, owing to the lack of transportation shipping infrastructure. The food system was broken, as were the lifeways associated with it. Now, before I take you back to a view of what was lost, I want to share an important Ojibwa traditional story which shares the Indigenous perspectives of this history. This story is shared with permission. Nanabusho, the first person and great teacher of the Anishinaabe, both human and spirit, wanted to understand the wonders he experienced as he walked the earth. He asked many questions of the Creator to satisfy his hunger for knowledge. Finally, growing tired of his questions, the Creator sent Nana Bujo to live with his grandmother. She was not of the world he knew. She held the wisdom of the spirits, what the elders hold, and Nana Bujo desired. He grew and experienced many things, but one day it was clear to him that he had to leave his kokum, grandma, and find his father. He had never seen his own mother and father. He had many unanswered questions about his family, so he returned to earth and continued his journey. He started from where a great body of salt water stretched out forever to the east. And he knew that in the land of Nigabayayang, west, he would find his father. So as he traveled westward, he came to a great many forests, beautiful rivers, and deep blue lakes. He stopped at a huge waterfall, Kichikabekong, Great Falls, he called it. From the roar of the great falls, he gained strength. Leaving the power of the falls, he continued and found the going was hard as he met with the Great Lakes and Gichigumi, the huge freshwater sea, and navigated around and across many rivers and lakes. And finally he came to the Grandfather River, the biggest river he had ever seen. He knew that this river gave life to the land in all directions and must always be respected and even appeased because it held great power. The river seemed impossible to cross. Its waters were deep and fast. All at once the waters of the river spoke to Nana Bujo, saying, "I am Michizibi, the greatest river. What brings you to my shore?" Nana Bujo told him about his journey to his father, and he needed to cross over, but the river just flowed on. Finally, Nana Bujo thought about his asema, his tobacco, his first gift, and offering his asema, sprinkling it into the water as an offering to the river. The river said, "I can sense that you are determined to continue your journey no matter what I tell you. I can see that you are sincere in your purpose. I will show you a place to cross my waters." After Nana Bujo safely crossed the river, spoke again to warn him, "You will soon meet another princess of all rivers. She is Ogima Akwe Zibi, the Missouri. Together we are the main arteries of Mother Earth. We help to drain and purify her blood. You must speak with her as a boy might speak to his aunt or his grandmother." Nana Bujo continued walking to the west. The land flattened out into a big mushkodang, a plain. One especially hot day on the prairie, he heard a great rumbling like thunder, and saw a huge cloud hanging close to the earth. Soon the earth began to tremble, and it was not long until he realized the many animals running to him were Mushkode Bashiki, buffalo he had seen once on his journey long before he found the lodge of his grandmother. Those buffalo gathered up, forming a wall, and would not let Nana Bujo go on. He waited for 4 days. Finally, a mighty buffalo, Shibi Shiki, came forward and said, "We have tried to dissuade you from your journey, but you seem determined. So I will walk with you a ways and guide you. Sometime the winds bring the snow that covers the earth and can cause you to become blind and lost forever. Only I am able to survive. If this happens, stand at my side and I shall protect you. I will do this because I am one of your oldest brothers." As they traveled, Shibi Shiki told Nana Bujo many more things. He told him how each being on the earth has a purpose to fulfill in life, and that we as brothers and sisters must seek to understand and respect that purpose. Then he explained to him what he should do when he approached the land of his father. Finally, as they were approaching the high mountains, the giant buffalo said, "I must leave you now, but I will give you a gift. In the future, if you ever need me, I will help you as an older brother should. I will be waiting in the land of the west." Nana Bujo did not understand all that Shiki told him, but he kept the conversation with him in his heart as he continued in search of his father. Shiki waited, standing in the western land with his legs grounded in the earth like solid tree trunks. Nanabujo went on his way and found his father. Now it is sometimes related by the Ojibwa elders of how Shiki has stood at the western doorway looking this way over the lives of the native people of the land. He is said to be the spirit of the buffalo that guided Nanabujo across the Great Plains. He is a guardian of Indian people everywhere. When life was good for the native people of this continent and brotherhood, sisterhood, and respect ruled over the land, this buffalo was very powerful. With all his might, the buffalo pledged to stand firm in protection of the natural people. But, as the elders say, time passed. The Blackcoats, Christian missionaries, came and divided the people from their original instructions, and Shiki lost one of his legs. He sacrificed it so that the native people could go on living. Still, Shiki stood strong for the people with only 3 legs to support him. Then the armies of the light-skinned race came and began to remove the people from their homelands, to wipe out entire tribes of people, and to turn nations against each other. Shiki sacrificed yet another one of his legs. Still, he stood tall as best as he could, determined not to fall. But soon the granddaughters and grandsons of the native people began to turn their backs on the teachings of their elders. The elders lost their reasons for living, and Shiki lost one more of his legs. Only one leg remained, so that he could balance and hold his position in the western doorway. The buffalo knew that if he failed in his task of guardianship, that there would be no hope for Indian people to survive. He gathered all his remaining strength and stood fast to this ground. The elders say, yet even now, Shiki still stands, as he has for so long, resting on his remaining leg. He knows if he fails his job of protecting the people, there will be no hope for Indian people to survive. Shiki planted himself and remained strong for the natural people in that place where the Old North Trail is carved along the Rocky Mountain front. A rich home for both the buffalo and the people related to him. The web of relationship, including human and non-human relatives, fed the vitality of the food system and the Bison culture foodway. In this place, the ancient grandfathers, the Rocky Mountains, stood tall, reaching to the sky and gathering snow. Nibi, the water, did her work as ancient glacial flows spilled out of the spaces in between the mountains and carved an undulating prairie landscape at their feet, protected spaces for plants and people. The grass sprang from the moistened earth in tender, nutritious shoots and sustained the bison and the other hoofed ones, the crawling ones, the flying ones. The people fed the grass with fire and their handiwork as they tended the wild plots they harvested. The beavers engineered the landscape, building quiet side pools where water plants comprised filter systems to clean the water along its journey. The wind uncovered the grass in the winter for the bison, who provided sustenance for the wolves and the people. All these many relatives and many more participated and made possible a lifeway which sprang from our elder brother, the buffalo. Together they comprised the buffalo culture. In that place where Nanabujo parted from Shiki lies one of the most ancient and well-used travel corridors in North America, the Old North Trail, which tells the story of how movement over the land and engagement in a much larger web of relationship supported the Bison culture lifeway. The Old North Trail connected the furthest Arctic communities to the north to the warm desert communities of the south in a web of relationship in which the buffalo culture people hunted, prayed, cultivated, harvested, and traded. The trail may also have connected the native peoples of Eurasia and Central and South America. The more we understand the trail and its uses, the more we understand the complexity of the Bison culture lifeway. The Bison culture homeland, or Old North Trail corridor, was marked by the Rocky Mountains on the western edge and arched to the east, encompassing the northern mixed prairie and many island mountain ranges, including the Little Rockies and the Cypress Hills. It extended eastward to the confluence of the Yellowstone and Missouri rivers, where the veins of Medeaki, Mother Earth, flowed together and marked a convergence of waters and a long-standing point of convergence for Indigenous exchange, the place where the Mandan of the Missouri River villages ran their Indigenous way station. Trails followed the water to the convergence and onward as people and materials traveled east and west. If you walk the trail today, you would find a series of braided trails running along the eastern front of the Rocky Mountains, marked by stone cairns, effigies, and campsites. Part of the trail hugs the mountains, while other channels meander to medicine wheels and buffalo harvest sites. In the early 20th century, when Bison culture had come to its end, Natosine brings down the sun, a noted Pekani medicine person, reported that travois tracks and horse trails were still plainly visible from the movement of many generations of travelers over the Old North Trail. People often want to know the age of the trail. Here is what is known. Bison culture existed here for at least 13,000 years. It is the longest standing lifeway in North America. We know that movement over the landscape occurred in the Bison culture lifeway in a pattern we call the seasonal round. The people used stone quarries in the north and south of the trail corridor throughout those 13,000 years. And there is evidence by oral histories, DNA, lithic scatter, and food remnants in ancient sites which demonstrate constant and culturally complex existence in the corridor. To understand the duration of this lifeway, one has to wrestle with the complexity of the web of relationship. Some have called this the human nature divide, but it was never divided in the view of the natural people. The area around the Rocky Mountain front where the plains and mountains meet was a place where, for millennia, buffalo herds moved in during the winter. These wintering herds were important to the people as long as the two existed. Conditions encouraged herds to winter along the northern Rocky Mountain foothills, such as the availability of water and open grazing opportunities. While some buffalo migrated out of the area in the winter, smaller, localized herds wintered over due to favorable conditions. The natural people participated in what has been described as opportunistic hunting all year long. Large-scale communal hunts, which utilized jumps, were organized primarily in late fall or early spring and procured large quantities of meat, fat, bone, and hides that had to be obtained and processed in a short time. As my colleague Marie Zedeno says, the magnitude of this task and its facilities demanded organized labor from most or all members of the hunting community. Here, millennial knowledge of landscape and prey were put to practice daily. Movement across the land represented the pathway of life, the way in which indigenous ways of knowing and being functioned in an interdependent web of being that comprised the food system. Buffalo culture flexed and shifted in its relational composition over time. In the era 8,000 to 5,000 years ago, a time of climate warming called the ultrathermal, the gigantic bison, known in Western classification as Bison antiquus, died off, and a smaller bison, Bison, emerged. The food system surely flexed during this time as coevolution of buffalo and human species occurred. In the web of existence, nature and culture are never static. Adaptation, or the notion of being flexible to that which is given to us, was at the heart of ancestral indigenous foodways. From season to season and year to year, the diet was varied, and the people adapted to the food that was available. As the natural people followed the instinctive pathway along the mountains from the north to south, they participated in a large reciprocal network of exchange with human and non-human relatives. New customs, technologies, foods, and ceremonies were integrated, as were new microbes, genes, and people. The exchange of knowledge, too, was constant. Knowledge gleaned from place, transferred from ancestors, handed down from relatives, human and non, or what we now refer to as indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge. The Old North Trail, like any transportation route, was a conduit for change, reducing relative isolation and the limitations of what the biome of home was able to produce and experience. Movement over the landscape supported life. In addition to the waterways, the natural people followed the contours of the land to the four directions. The Old North Trail marked north-south movement alongside and through mountain passageways, like its intersection with the Buffalo Trail. Sin Ne Epes brings down the sun. Father once told him the trail originated in the migration of a great tribe of Indians from the distant north to the south, and that all tribes have ever since continued to follow in their tracks. The Dene, or Navajo, migrated from the far north to the desert southwest during the Little Ice Age, or sometime between 1200 and 1400. This may have been the group that Natrosin Nepe's father referred to. In addition to oral histories like that of Brings Down the Sun, we have other old ones who also tell the story. The natural people look to the grandfathers, our relatives who are much older than us, have been here longer, and have something to teach us. We call the stones and trees grandfathers. In the case of the Old North Trail, much of the story is told through the stone tools which helped the people in securing and preparing food, the stones that were piled in cairns to mark the way, and arranged in images of spiritual beings to remind the people to acknowledge the spirits. There were also grandfathers arranged or carved to form celestial clocks, and ones whose faces are painted with shield figures and winter counts, both marking the passing of time and relationships with all that is. Many ceremonial sites of great significance, similarity, and difference are spread throughout the corridor and beyond. The stones are medicine, tools, and storytellers. In the farthest southwest corner of the Old North Trail corridor is a place called Mammoth Meadow in Horse Prairie Valley. It lies on the border of the present-day states of Montana and Idaho. Here, stone and water, representing a balance of female and male energy and Anishinaabe ways of knowing, worked together in deep time to form salacious veins of stone altered by the hydrothermal Yellowstone hotspot. In time, water and stone worked together again through glacial movement, which uncovered these veins and distributed their contents southward down the valley. This repetitive work of water and stone produced chert, a highly useful hard stone made of quartz crystals, essential to Buffalo culture people who made scrapers, knives, spears, and arrowheads of it. The ancient quarries at Horse Prairie, like many others, were in use 13,000 years ago. The Old North Trail and the east-west waterways which it crossed were essential paths to and from quarries where the grandfathers were gathered and carried away as material to be crafted and processed into tools. The excavated, carbon-dated, and interpreted archaeological record points to the existence of this ancient transportation route along the Rockies long before the Dene headed for warmer climes. The stone tools used in indigenous foodways provided evidence for the use of the trail for harvesting and exchange of stone tools and stone tool material. Like chert, Obsidian is one of the ancient relatives who tells the story of the weathered relationship of North America's longest standing lifeway. Obsidian, a volcanic glass stone, can be black, gray, red-brown, and many other colors. It is 10 times sharper than surgical steel. It was used to make precision knives and spear points, and used in healing procedures. It was honored for the medicinal work that it did. Obsidian was highly prized by indigenous peoples from coast to coast. In recent years, Western scientists have been able to develop methods of tracing chemical composition of obsidian and other stone tools. These kinds of archaeological understandings support the knowledge of indigenous peoples, testifying to the complexity and sophistication of their cultures, teachings, and practices. Yurok and Wintu people of present-day California hold ancient stories that detail personal journeys of great sacrifice made for obsidian, that drive home respect for the power of the stone and the fire that made it, and that associate the stone with lending great hunting and medicinal abilities. The natural people who live in the Ohio River Valley in between 200 BC and 600 AD, known as the Hopewell people to archaeologists, built elaborate earthen work mound structures, aligned with astronomical movements, created exquisite artwork related to their complex ceremonial life, and traded all over North America. They built complex burial mounds for their relatives and prepared them for their work in the next world by placing Yellowstone, obsidian points, and other tools made of precious Western materials with them. A cast copper horn in the shape of a Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep horn, believed to have been used by Ojibwa people in Meday ceremony, and a substantial deposit of Yellowstone obsidian were amongst Hopewell cultural findings. It was theorized that those who delivered these items to the mound builders, perhaps mound builders themselves, would have traveled the well-worn copper routes and overland trails used by woodland peoples. But then, in 2009, on the shore of Yellowstone Lake, in the furthest southern range of the Old North Trail corridor, a large obsidian projectile point carved from cliff obsidian was discovered. Given the proximity of 13 obsidian quarries in the greater Yellowstone area, this may have been a relatively unremarkable finding, except for the fact that its carving resembled that of Hopewell points that came from the Ohio River Valley. The stones tell the story of a complex system of exchange, common ceremonial practices, and far-reaching travels to harvest and trade valued materials. Ancient and well-used roads were here long before European arrival. As strangers began to infiltrate the Western Hemisphere, they followed the native roads, often with native guides whose knowledge of place was essential to strangers' exploration and survival, as Lewis and Clark did. This expansive system of roads was, as geographer Carl Sauer said, as direct as the terrain, the need of food and drink en route, and reasonable security permitted, and were fixed by long experience as the best way of traversing a particular stretch of country. Natsosin Nepe, Brings Down the Sun, explained the reach of the roads leaving the Old North Corridor. The trail forked where the city of Calgary now stands. The right fork ran into the Barren Lands as far as people live. The main trail ran south along the eastern side of the Rockies, at a uniform distance from the mountain, keeping clear of the forest and outside of the foothills. It ran close to the city where the city of Helena now stands, and extended south into the country, inhabited by a people with dark skins and long hair falling over their faces, Mexico. Brings Down the Sun's father told him of an expedition from the Blackfeet that went south by the old trail to visit the people with dark skins. They were absent 4 years. It took them 12 moons of steady traveling to reach the country of the dark-skinned people, and 18 moons to come north again. They returned by a longer route through the high tree or bitterroot country where they could travel without danger of being seen. At times there would have been great incentives to make this long journey. For example, to conduct trade with the ancient Sonoran desert people, desert farmers, ancestors of the Odom, Hopi, and Zuni, who with their exquisite irrigation systems in the Phoenix Basin cultivated diverse crops including corn, squash, and beans, cotton, and tobacco. Called the Hohokam culture by archaeologists, these ancestors created a point of exchange for people who traveled great distance by foot and some with dogs from all directions to their homeland. The ancient Sonoran desert people were water engineers who around 400 to 500 current era began to build canals to bring river water to their crops. The canals were, on average, 20 feet deep, 75 feet wide, and 15 to 20 miles long. The construction of over 120 miles of canals, watering somewhere between 30,000 and 60,000 acres of land, is estimated to have required 25,000 person days. Like the mound builders to the east, the old ones of the desert created elaborate houses and ceremonies and drew people and the exchange of goods to their communities. In the same vein, the Bison culture people of the Northwestern Plains lived a lifeway highly ritualized and regulated hunt as suggested by an association between, for example, communal hunting sites, ceremonial structures, and rock art in the Sun River Valley of Montana. Moving as the Athabascan-speaking Dene did down the Old North Trail, the Piikani, the Blackfeet and Blackfoot, and other Northwestern Plains peoples may have made their way to the southern desert and beyond, partaking in a much broader food system, returning with diverse ceremonial experiences, woven corn husk ceremonial bags, beans, and corn. Such travel is further evidenced by the presence of Alberta pipestone found in Chaco Canyon, where the ancestral Puebloan peoples built elaborate ceremonial facilities, great houses for hosting visitors from afar, and an immense marketplace. Historians and archaeologists alike agree that the influence of historical processes associated with multi-ethnic interaction cannot be overstated, including trade of raw materials and foodstuffs and ritual knowledge. The natural people were connected to one another and to the land. Their movement brought life in all its forms. Studies of Native American maps of the Northwestern Plains have shown that place names, for example, names of rivers, did not reveal their navigability, but rather described the resources available in their proximity, like the presence of a buffalo pound nearby, or the absence of vegetation along a river's bottomlands. Julie Cruikshank has observed that the natural people in general, quote, use the landscape for ordering the events in their lives and those in the history of the group, end quote. Beyond movement over the landscape for sustenance, we know the stones tell the story of movement through a sacred landscape. Effigies, rock art, stone structures such as fasting sites and medicine wheels reflect a highly sophisticated ceremonial life. Through ceremonial structures, spiritual societies emerged and ritual land practices developed, such as regulation of buffalo hunting according to religious beliefs and for the good of the web of life. Archaeologists Otelar and Meyer observed that, quote, human groups humanize an environment by mapping themselves onto the landscape, using their knowledge of specific landforms and waterways, resources including minerals, plants, and animals, and human settlements. Once established, the human imprint transforms the natural landscape into a cultural landscape and establishes a pattern of land use which can persist for generations, if not millennia. This is precisely what is meant by calling ourselves the natural people, and in describing a worldview in which Mother Earth is the first teacher. Nature and culture are one, not separated, as in the way of Enlightenment thinking, Linnaean classification of species, and Christian dogma. The Old North Trail was used for movement through a sacred landscape, and is part of a highly sophisticated, far-reaching indigenous food system and trade network. The Old North Trail, as part of a network of trails, was used for movement in the seasonal round. Through my research, I have come to define the seasonal round as this: a highly sophisticated, methodical annual series of movements on the land to tend wild plots, cultivate, hunt, harvest, and trade, a cycle following the path laid by ancestors, who, honoring reciprocal obligations to place, sought to maintain the sacred balance amongst relations. Here you see my emerging, still incomplete, in need of great revision, graphic of the Bison culture seasonal round. As you can see by the names of the month in Ojibwa on the outside circle, the people have grafted nature and culture. The month names represent movement in the cycle of hunting and harvesting. Organizing a community according to the times when various foods are ready to harvest takes a great deal of leadership, a strong division of labor, flexibility, and an abundance of ecological knowledge handed down over generations. The photos in the middle layer of the graphic begin to demonstrate the movement of the people over the landscape. Canadian environmental historian Ted Binnema observed that the end of the last ice age left a sculpted landscape conducive for bison culture. The camps were along these bottomlands that provided not only a safe harbor from the wind and harshness of the climate, but a fertile place for wild harvest and cultivation of food. And you can see that there's other places. They were in the foothills. They were out on the prairie, as well as the river bottomlands. Natural features as we know them, or non-human relatives, and landscape engineering were the keys to bison culture prosperity. One relative of defining importance in the Old North Trail corridor was grass. The northern mixed prairie held both cool season grasses, which began growing earlier in the spring and often entered a second growth in the fall, and also warm season grasses. The area of the corridor is divided by xeric, dry, mixed grasslands, and mesic, moist, mixed grasslands, and then surrounded on three sides by the relatively luxuriant fescue prairie. In the island ranges, along the mountain foothills, and in the river and stream valleys, a symbiotic relationship between shade, water, grass, and wind existed and nurtured bison herds for millennia. Douglas Bamforth brought forward a view of this complex system. He observed that the magic of this place was not in the total annual carrying capacity of the grasslands in providing forage for the bison throughout the year. Instead, the key was the quality of forage available to bison in the critical transition from winter to spring, the hungry time of the year. Following Bamforth's work, Ted Binnema developed a model which demonstrates the narrow passage of the hungry time, when early forage is the key to carrying capacity, the bison hourglass. In order to understand the neck of the hourglass, it's important to examine the total nutrients, not the total forage available to bison at the leanest time of the year. Forage abundance can differ significantly from forage quality, particularly in late winter and early spring when the grasses have not grown for about 7 months. The little tender shoots of early growing cool season grasses were high in protein and so dominated the moist prairie that such places had twice the carrying capacity as the dry prairie. Though the northeastern plains produced more forage than other areas of the Great Plains, owing to the cool season grasses, forage on the northwestern plains was of considerably higher quality during the critical period of the year. This sort of makes the Rocky Mountain front kind of the last best place for bison culture. Places like the Milk River Ridge, Sweetgrass Hills, Cypress Hills, and Bear's Paw Mountains supported rough fescue and were consequently favored campsites for people who lived in deep relationship with the buffalo. Just as the natural people anticipated where the buffalo would be during the hungry time, when those rich, tender grasses emerged, the knowledge and experience of their ancestors helped them to move deliberately from place to place. They did not wander aimlessly looking for bison. A balance of moisture and evaporation, water and wind supported the moist prairie habitat. The foehn winds, or Chinook winds of the region, dried and cured the grasses, a process that maintained high nutritive content for grazers. A Chinook can melt many feet of snow overnight, as temperatures often shift in a range of 40 to 100 degrees. In the southwest part of the Old North Corridor, the Chinook belt, these winds kept the area generally snow-free and relatively warmer throughout the winter. The energy that is created as warm, moist air lifts over the Rocky Mountains and then cools and condenses is the energy that drives these warm winds. It is the work of heat and moisture, fire and water, sun and moon, and the grandfathers, the ancient stone mountains, which allowed the wind to do its work, to cure the grasses which fed the bison and the people. From the Ojibwa worldview, these elements represent the balance of male and female energy that makes all life happen. The Old North Corridor, prior to European arrival, was a space occupied by a web of relations, human and non. It is a place deeply inscribed with multiple, complex, and overlapping natural and cultural signatures of deep antiquity. One natural cultural inscription was that of native land practices. These practices are chronicled in the landscape and have been documented by archaeologists. They are also outlined in the journals of early Euro-American capitalist adventurers and explorers, and in at least one case, a treaty between the American government and tribes. One of these land practices was the use of fire. Strategic burning improved forage for bison and elk and created ideal conditions for key plant elements of the diet. Fire-hardy Saskatoon berries, one of my favorites, and prairie turnips, my grandma's favorite. By burning in the fall or even winter, the buffalo could be directed toward their wintering ground, and fescue grasses were encouraged to sprout earlier in the spring. Fire significantly maintained a bison habitat because without it, the forests tend to invade the most productive fescue grasslands first. Bison too held down woody growth when they took shelter from winter in the stands of aspens and willows as they wallowed, browsed, and trampled saplings. Whether fires were set by the elements or humans, their contribution was to increase nutritive value of the grasslands. If grass burned in summer, fall, or winter, it would come back 1 to 2 weeks earlier in the spring than unburned grasses. For most all grass, burning increased productivity. The Blackfeet Treaty also presents evidence of native land practices. Drawn by council at the confluence of the Judith and Missouri rivers in 1855, the treaty did not follow the standard methods of government interaction with native peoples. It did not extinguish title to Aboriginal lands, nor did it remove native peoples to reservations. In fact, it was not a treaty, a land treaty at all. It was a peace treaty which recognized a common hunting ground. Though poorly orchestrated and reflective mainly of settlers' desire to confine native presence on the land, the treaty shines light on native land practices that predated contact. Walter McClintock, ethnographer and adopted Blackfeet tribal member, wrote, "Tribal regulations for hunting buffalo were not characteristic of the Blackfeet alone, but were used by the other Plains tribes as necessary protection for their common interests. According to the Journal of Alexander Henry, a partner in the Northwestern Company of Montreal, 1806, the tribal policy of the Mandans in the matter of hunting buffalo was one of comedy toward neighboring tribes at peace with them, of provident conservation in hunting them, and of humane consideration of the poorest and helpless in the distribution of meat. Police power was exercised to prevent exploitation of the bison, the heart of life. Amongst the Blackfoot bands, consecrated space for symbolic enactments of the hunt, esoteric societies, and bundle groups were powerful regulatory practices of the bison culture lifeway. The bison culture seasonal round of the Northwestern Plains was more than a means of sustenance to Indigenous peoples. The annual series of movements through the environment, which involved tending wild plots, trading, hunting, and harvesting, also honored relationships to ancestral and spiritual beings through rituals of respect and reciprocity. The seasonal round was both a highly developed and enduring food system and a ritual practice of relationship with sacred landscape. From the Ojibwa point of view and those of other bands of the interethnic Bison society, humans were an integral part of the place to which they belonged. Archaeologist Gerald Odelar stated, quote, over long periods of time, the decisions and actions of the Blackfoot people, guided by their specific worldview, created the very ecosystem in which they lived. That is, the people created the fescue pastures in the foothills, managed the biologically diverse resources patches scattered along the landscape, end quote. In conclusion, the web of relationship that was Bison culture endured for at least 13,000 years, perhaps longer. Buffalo culture was the longest sustained human lifeway in North American history, and so has much to teach us with regard to sustainability. The enduring strength of the buffalo, the work of the wind, water, plant nations, fire, earth, people, and many other species together sustained life. It was by the nuanced work of each member of the web of relationship that an enduring and vital food system, the buffalo culture food system, existed. Shibi Shiki still stands in the western doorway and holds our first teaching for us, respect for the gift of life. He is a teacher and a relative, and he still stands. Miigwech. Thank you.
Want to take some questions, Jill?
Sure.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
We can turn the house up. Can we turn the house lights up, please? Are you done?
He's going to try it. Go ahead. If anyone has any questions for Jill. Yes.
Do you know the population of the Native Americans in the 14th century in North America?
The question is, do I know the population of